Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. Part 2. Colonisation and Conflict. The Skeldings were the first group of humans to come to Halfland. The next people to arrive were also humans, the Lyxians, city dwellers from the south. Now, some say that the Lyxians were fugitives from Atlantis, which was destroyed at this time. This seems unlikely. Not only does scholarly convention have it that Atlantis is a myth and was not a reality, but the fragments of Lyxian that have come down to us bear no resemblance to the Atlantean language. Further, Atlantis was destroyed within a day, and any survivors would therefore have had to hurriedly flee in a disorganised and unprepared fashion. However, the Lyxians arrived in Halfland as a coherent, well-organised body, well equipped and well prepared to settle in a new land. In fact, the Lyxians came from Lyxia, which was a prosperous land of fertile plains and hill country. But as the waters rose, the fertile plains were submerged, and the hill country was not sufficient to support the population. Lyxia was at that time a democracy, and the people therefore assembled to discuss what they should do. It was agreed that the remaining land was only sufficient to comfortably feed half of the current population. So the assembly ruled that half of the people should remain in Lyxia, and the other half should be sent away as colonists to seek a new land in which to dwell. The Lyxians therefore busied themselves building and provisioning a large fleet of ships. After a year, everything was ready. There was no shortage of people wanting to join the colonists. Many of the families who farmed the plains had lost all their land to the rising waters and were reduced to destitution. And many other people at the bottom of society saw this as an opportunity to make a new start and better themselves. In fact, the demand for places in the ships was so high that these had to be allocated by lot. This caused discontent among those who were not allocated places, and, after the ships departed, this discontent boiled over into civic disturbance, which ultimately led to the downfall of the original Lyxian society and culture. But that history falls outside the compass of these writings. The colonists assembled and debated which direction to sail in. Some wanted to sail east. Some wanted to sail west. A smaller number wanted to sail north. The main advocate for heading north was a man called Krantos, who was the younger son of a minor landowner. He argued that the lands to the east and west were populated, and that in order to settle there, the Lyxians would first have to fight and drive off the current inhabitants. No one had ever come to Lyxia from the north, so the lands there must be empty, and the Lyxians could therefore settle there unopposed. The majority argued that the reason no one had come to Lyxia from the north was that in that direction the sea stretched away endlessly. To sail north would therefore be to sail forever, to sail to certain death. And even if there was land to the north, it would be cold and desolate, which is why no one lived there. Krantos countered that if there was no land to the north to bound the ocean, then the waters would pour away over the edge of the earth, and the seabed would be dry. And in these times, when the solid land was dissolving into ocean, and the climate changed from year to year, who could say whether the north would be hot or cold or temperate? The assembly discussed these matters back and forth for 3 days and reached no conclusion. On the 4th day, it was agreed that the fleet should divide into 3 parts, one to head eastwards, one westwards, and one in a northerly direction. And so it was done. Those sailing in each fleet then assembled separately to decide who should sail in each ship and how they should organise themselves. Those sailing north voted that Krantos should be their leader, and they all took an oath to obey him, an oath which was sealed by sacrificing 10 cows to the gods of the sea and feasting on the meat. 3 days later the wind was from the south, and the northbound fleet sailed. There is no record of when the other 2 fleets sailed, or of what happened to them. But Krantos' ships ran before a fair wind, heading broadly northwards for 7 days before sighting land. That land was the south coast of Halfland, and Krantos sailed along that coast until he came to the mouth of a river that he named the Great River. This river was indeed one of the major rivers of Halfland, which had its source in the northern mountains to the east of the Dwarvish lands, and flowed right across the island to its southern shore. At the mouth of the great river, the Lyxians measured out plots of land for each household and built a city, which they named Nulixia in memory of their homeland. At this point, some of the Lyxians questioned whether Krantos should continue to lead them, or whether they should revert to a democratic government now that the colony was established. Krantos called an assembly and spoke thus. "Fellow citizens," he said, "back in our mother country you listened to my advice and considered that it was sound. Accordingly, you swore an oath to obey me and sealed it with a solemn sacrifice. Since you swore that oath, I have delivered all that I promised to you. I have brought you to an empty and fertile land where you and your children can live in peace and prosperity. I now hear that some of you wish to turn your backs on that oath and be governed by me no longer. If that is your will, then so it will be. I am but one man, and I cannot stand against you all. But I caution you that the gods will not look kindly upon those who break a sacred oath and turn against a man who has guided them so well and given them so much." This speech was met with general acclaim, but then one of the leading citizens rose to his feet. "Krantos," he said, "you speak truly. You have indeed guided us well, and I for one have no desire to be an oath breaker. There is no suggestion of overthrowing you by force. But while concentrating power in the hands of one man who can act decisively and quickly is a prudent course of action in times of emergency, it is less so in times of peace. Such a man is inevitably in a position to do great harm to his fellow citizens, should he so choose. Our ancestors experienced the rule of tyrants. They have passed down to us an understanding of the torments that form of government can inflict upon a people, and you will therefore understand our concern. As your loyal subject, I therefore request that a code of laws is written, setting out what is to be permitted and what is to be punished, and what those punishments will be, and what will be the limits of the powers that you can exercise against the citizens of New Lyxia." This speech was also met with general acclaim. Krantos responded, "I agree to your request, which is wise and reasonable," he said. "We will appoint the most just among us to write down a code of laws for this city, based on the customary and best practices of our forebears. But that code of laws will also confirm me and my male descendants after me as your king. When I and those who come after me are crowned, we will swear to abide by those laws, and the citizens of New Lyxia will do likewise." And so it was that, in the year 5 of the Common Reckoning, Crantos became the king of New Lyxia. The following years were prosperous and peaceful for the inhabitants of Halfland. Both the Skeldings and Lyxians increased in numbers, but spent those years developing the lands on which they had settled, rather than expanding their territory. In the north, the halfling population grew, and the halflings settled new lands, moving eastwards along the northern bank of the Silver Stream, up to the feet of the Silvermere Mountains. The dwarves also multiplied. Dwarvish settlers moved westward from South Vale and down into the plains, where they started to clear the forest and farm the land. And so it was that dwarves and halflings found that they were living as neighbours on opposite banks of the Silver Stream, immediately below the point where that river emerged from its gorge beneath the slopes of the Old Mother. Now, the halflings and the dwarves had previously been aware of each other. Indeed, for many years trade had passed between them. Dwarvish traders would travel from South Vale, crossing the Silver Stream at Drown Daisy Ford, and onward to Hillfoot, where they would provide the halflings with intricately inlaid dwarf-fashioned knives and other finely crafted items, which the halflings valued highly. In return, the halflings would provide the dwarves with pipeweed, which was very popular among the dwarves. But at this time, the volume of trade significantly increased. The dwarvish traders saw that the land on the halflings' bank of the Silver Stream was fertile. They also saw that the halflings did not cultivate the land within a mile or so of the river, which was therefore unoccupied. These observations circulated amongst the dwarvish farmers, and so a family of dwarfs crossed the Drown Daisy Ford and started to farm that unoccupied land. This did not go down well with the halflings. The halflings did not farm the land by the river because they did not want to get too close to the water. But it was still halfling land, and the dwarves had no right to it. The family of dwarves died as they worked their newly won fields, pierced by halfling arrows, and their newly built homestead was burned. This did not go down well with the dwarves, and the flames of their indignation were fanned by the rhetoric of Hogni. At that time, Hogni was in his early 50s. He was one of the first dwarves who had moved to the plains, where he had cleared an area of forest and successfully farmed the fields he thus created. But his ambitions of expanding his landholdings were frustrated, as other dwarves moved to the region and cleared the land adjacent to his fields for themselves. Hogni now saw an opportunity to lead a military expedition against the halflings, seize their land, and thus establish himself as the ruler of a new dwarvish territory on the far bank of the Silver Stream. Exhorting his fellow dwarves to follow him and avenge their dwarvish kindred, promising them an easy victory and fertile halfling land, he managed to raise a band of around 350 dwarves, and, in the year 19 of the Common Reckoning, he marched them to Drown Daisy Ford. The halflings had learned of their coming, and at Drown Daisy Ford a similarly sized force was waiting on the far bank of the Silver Stream, intent on preventing the dwarves from crossing. The halfling slingers inflicted heavy casualties on the dwarves as they moved up to and across the ford. Bloody hand-to-hand fighting ensued at the river's edge as the dwarves sought to force their way up the riverbank. But the halflings stood firm, and the Dwarves were forced to withdraw. Following this defeat, the Dwarves and the halflings made peace, and the Silver Stream was confirmed as the boundary between the peoples. Hogni was reviled by many of the Dwarves for leading them on a reckless adventure and throwing lives away to further his own ambition. Hogni argued that, had more Dwarves followed him, the victory would have been his, and so the cowardice of the many had been the death of the few. This argument was not widely accepted, and he and his remaining supporters subsequently moved south and settled to the southwest of Lordsgrave, under the north-facing slopes of the Dark Hills. In the year 20 of the Common Reckoning, the orcs arrived in Halfland. A fleet of approximately 100 Orkan ships, led by King Snaga the Seafarer, sailed through the straits by the mountain that the orcs called Snaga Peak, and into the inland sea on the east of the island. The orcs settled on the shores of the inland sea, by the mouth of the river that they called the Orkan Flood, and that settlement they called Orkanholm. Now, there is a lot of nonsense talked about orcs. The true scientific facts are as follows. Firstly, orcs do not have green skin. They do not photosynthesize. They are hominids, and whoever heard of a green hominid? Indeed, orcs do not even appear to be a distinct species. As far as I can tell, orcs are of the species Homo sapiens. That is to say, that the orcs are simply another tribe of humans. This is supported by the fact that orcs can interbreed with humans and produce viable offspring, whereas goblins, dwarves and halflings cannot. The association between orcs and the colour green appears to have arisen because at the time the orcs arrived in Halfland, the aurora borealis was very active. The Orkan fleet therefore sailed into the inland sea under a flickering green sky. In this eerie light, reflected from the water, the faces of the orcs did appear to be green, and the first generation of orcs that settled in Halfland were subsequently known as the Green Faces. But their skin was not actually green. One belief about orcs that is well founded is that they are violent. The hierarchies of Orkan society were entirely based on physical violence. That society recognised only two classes of people: slave masters and slaves. All orcs were born into slavery. A child automatically became the slave of its father if its father was a slave master, or of its father's master if its father was a slave. The same principles applied to relations between the sexes. An Orkan wife was the slave of her husband if that husband was a slave master, or of her husband's master if her husband was a slave. It was possible to escape slavery. Any enslaved orc could at any time challenge his master to ritual combat. This combat was fought hand to hand and to the death. If the enslaved orc defeated his master, he would step into his place, taking ownership of the slain orc's slaves and other property. It might be that the victor of a ritual combat subsequently died of his wounds, or even that a slave master died of natural causes. This would free all of his slaves. There was no requirement for a slave master to own slaves, so a freed slave would automatically become a slave master, at least in terms of his societal status. It was possible to enslave a slave master. A slave master could challenge another slave master to ritual combat. The challenged slave master could choose whether to fight this combat singly or with his slaves. If the combat was single, the challenged slave master would either fight his challenger or one of his challenger's slaves, nominated by the challenger. Otherwise, each slave master could bring as many of his slaves as he chose to the combat, which would be between the two groups. Combats between slave masters, whether or not slaves were involved, did not have to be fought to the death. Either slave master could concede victory to his opponent at any time, but if he survived, the defeated slave master would become the slave of the victorious slave master, who would also take ownership of the loser's slaves and other property. When the death of a slave master resulted in his slaves becoming free, those ex-slaves would generally fight a series of ritual combats among themselves, until one of them succeeded as establishing himself as master of all the others. The new slave master would then take over all the deceased slave master's property. One consequence of these practices was that power in Orkan society did not generally pass from father to son. Instead, power was held by those who were physically strongest and most skilled in fighting at any particular time. Maybe because ritual combat was always hand to hand, the orcs came to regard any other form of combat with contempt. A true orc stood in front of his enemy and struck at him with axe or sword. Striking your foes at a distance by throwing javelins, slinging stones, or shooting arrows or crossbow bolts at them, or whatever, was regarded as craven and disreputable. And this social pressure was so strong that orcs never used such weapons, even in warfare, which on occasion put them at a severe disadvantage. A slave master's power over his slaves was absolute, and a slave master would regard it as a mark of extreme disrespect if another orc issued orders to one of his slaves. Doing so could lead to a formal challenge and ritual combat. But not all combat had to be ritual, so it might just lead to a stand-up fist fight between the offended and offending slave masters. The final aspect of the Orkan hierarchy to consider is kingship. In theory, a slave master could acquire an unlimited number of slaves, even a whole kingdom's worth. But this would require fighting a lot of ritual combats, both to win new slaves and to prevent existing slaves from winning their freedom. Suffering an injury in any of those combats, even in victory, would lead to further challenges from slaves who saw an opportunity to take their weakened slave master's place. In practice, then, an orc did not become a king by enslaving all of his subjects through ritual combat. A physically strong orc with a relatively large band of slaves could get other slave masters to do his bidding through the mere threat of issuing a challenge to ritual combat, calculating that those threatened would prefer obedience to fighting a ritual combat that would most likely end in their enslavement or death. If an orc was able to coerce enough other slave masters in this manner, he might declare himself to be a king. But such a kingship was always open to challenge, therefore precarious at best, and the life expectancy of Orkan kings was short. This can be seen in the case of Snarga, the king who brought the orcs to Halfland. 2 years later, he was challenged to a ritual combat by a slave master known as Grutta. It is not clear why Grutta issued this challenge. One very late source states that Grutta desired Snarga's wife and offered to buy her. When Snarga declined, Grutta challenged him to combat. However, there is no supporting evidence for this version of events, which is most likely to be a romantic invention. Contemporary sources do not explicitly state the reason that Grutter issued the challenge, but do imply that he resented being subordinate to Snarga. Whatever the motivation for the combat, it resulted in the death of Snarga. It does not seem that Grutter had any ambition to become king himself, or, if he did, that he was successful in this. For a period of several years after the death of Snarga, the orcs had no king, and this was by no means an unusual state of affairs. To close these comments in relation to orcs, I observe that Orkan society is often regarded as being intrinsically sexist. Indeed, following common practice, I have used masculine pronouns when referring to slave masters, as if women were disbarred from this role. This is arguably misleading. The cultural practices that I have described did not discriminate between men and women. In theory, a female orc with the physical strength and fighting ability to do so could become a slave master or even a queen. But in practice, such occurrences were extremely infrequent.